Okay, so hello and welcome everybody to my Workplace Wellbeing Wednesdays interview series. I basically on these series of interviews, I try to interview people who I really feel like get workplace well-being at a higher level and really see it as something that needs to be a strategic priority for organizations, and not just seeing workplace well-being as an initiative. So I really love to bring on people who are kind of thought leading in that space or have something unique to contribute to it. So I'm really excited to talk to Jessica Grossmeier, who I've gotten to know because we are both on the Workplace Wellbeing Initiative, which is part of the Global Wellness Institute. And so I've gotten to know her a good amount through there. And I've just always been so impressed by her just like level of knowledge and authenticity when it comes to talking about this subject. And she also has such a powerful story to share. And today I really want to focus this conversation on talking a bit about her burnout story, but also the connection between burnout and spiritual well-being, which is something that I rarely hear anybody talking about. And I think it's really important. And we'll also talk a bit about the difference between, kind of the role that the employee plays in their burnout and versus the employer. So I think that'll be a really interesting conversation. So just to share a bit about Jessica before we begin, Jessica Grossmeier is a PhD and an award-winning researcher and the author of Reimagining Workplace Well-being, which I have right here, fostering a culture of purpose, connection, and transcendence, which is so cool. Also never see that word used. She is a leading voice in workplace well-being, having dedicated her career to identifying evidence-based strategies that promote a thriving workplace. This includes conducting collaborative research, advising, writing, and speaking on topics related to workplace well-being best practices, measurement and evaluation, strategic planning, and value demonstration. She's a frequent speaker at national conferences and serves on several advisory boards devoted to helping employers create a workplace culture that fosters employee well-being. So I love everything about your bio, Jess, and thanks so much for, being on this. I really am just like so excited to talk to you and have this time to just like go deep on some of these things. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, Danielle. And as I've looked at your background and gotten to know you better, I feel like we're soul sisters in this work. We have a deep love for data and understanding what the research tells us, but also a deep appreciation for the human element of this work. Yeah. And trying to figure out how to bring those things together in a way that
and you started with
our
the
approaches.
soul word, right? The soul sisters word, and that's like exactly what we'll end up talking about today is like, what is the soul and where does that come into everything? So yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is definitely, I find it's rare to like meet people who have just like a passion about both sides of that, of the, spectrum, where it's like the research, because I am totally a research nerd and love like studying everything about well-being and happiness, as I know you have and do, and then looking at the deeper side of things. So totally agree. So would love to like start with your story, and I know that that's kind of, that is how your book opens, with kind of your aha moments of what you kind of experience in the workplace. And I'd love to have you just kind of like start there a little bit, maybe just share kind of where you were professionally and what you were working on, and kind of the nature of your work and how that kind of, transpired into you and your own kind of like injury and aha moment.
Yeah, so I started out, I've been in well-being my whole life, and in fact, workplace well-being, workforce well-being, if you will. And I have been a wellness junkie my whole life. When I was 15, I was buying books on nutrition, and I was trying to figure out how, as a competitive athlete, I could fuel my performance through better nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
I was into visualization and mindfulness back then, although I didn't have a formal practice. But I've always been interested in well-being from a personal standpoint, and I've been interested in spirituality, spiritual practices of a variety of different forms. And when I went into workplace well-being, I had a lot of passion for my work. And I pushed myself really, really hard because I cared so much about the work, but because I'm also very driven. And that's where the competitive athlete in me comes in. I'm very focused, I'm results oriented, and I like to accomplish my goals. And so I told a supervisor at one time, be careful about giving me goals because I'll go after them relentlessly. And so it can be a dangerous thing to put a goal in front of me, especially as I was coming into my career, because I was so driven and kind of hungry to prove myself. And so I was going along pretty nicely in my career for up until about 10 to 12 years ago. So my career in workplace well-being is about 25 years long. So about partway through that journey, I was in a leadership role in an organization. I was leading a function. I had been promoted through the ranks quite quickly in a research role at this point. I started out as a practitioner, and then I switched to research because I wanted to see how can we inform what we're doing with research and wrapping program evaluation around our work. And once I understood I was really good at that, and a lot of people in my profession weren't really into evaluation, I said, okay, I'm pivoting and I'm going to try to contribute to this. And so I was leading research at this point, and I had been undergoing a lot of different organizational changes. So I had a new round of bosses. It seemed like every year I had a different supervisor, and maybe every few years there was a new round of executive leadership. And so I was dealing at this point with a new round of executive leadership, again, trying really hard to prove myself and to help people understand what my function was about. You know, anytime you get a new boss, you have to sort of teach them, this is what I do, this is what I'm good at. So I was in the midst of all that.
And at this point, your role was what, or what level were you at?
I was, when I experienced my my actual physical collapse, which is where I opened the book, I was in a vice president position at that time. I think the warning signs and the cascade of events started to emerge earlier than that, but that's kind of where I was, where I opened the book. And, you know, it was a lot of...
I was asking that too, just because for the context of this conversation, like, I feel like that's important because sometimes it seems like burnout's happening at the lower levels of the organization. As you and I both know, that's not the case. It seems to be kind of spanning, you know, all industries and all levels. And so, you know, you were somebody who had a high, you know, you were in more of a higher level position, but still was going, you know, having this experience. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of people right now are focusing on the role of managers and leaders in helping to address burnout. And so I bring that perspective into this of what it was like to be in a position where I was an extremely high performer. That's why I was promoted so quickly through the organization. I got stuff done, but it was at great cost to my own personal well-being. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And so part of what it looked like when I was in this is by the time when things had gotten really, really bad, my day was pretty much back-to-back meetings all day long. I would get up early, try to do my own well-being thing. So I was at one point training for half marathons. I would juice in the morning. I would bring my fresh squeezed juices in and eat it all day because I didn't have time for lunch. So I was bringing healthy snacks with me and fueling myself throughout the day. I was a very devoted yoga practitioner
already at this point.
Saying.
Before your like kind of incident happened.
Yes. And so I was doing a lot of the things. I knew the importance of sleep. And so I was trying to do my best to take care of my well-being. But once I got to work, it was ready, go. And I would be going back to back pretty much all day.
And it's like so interesting to me about you, right? Because of the fact that I think like the fact that you were like you were basically studying wellness and workplace well-being inside and out, and practicing a lot of it like for yourself in terms of more the wellness side of things, like you just said, the yoga and, you know, eating healthy snacks and doing those. And yet you're still somebody who experienced, burnout. So it's like, I think it just shows like how this really is kind of hitting, everybody. Do you mind just starting from like, just like kind of what happened and like kind of the level that you reach, and then we'll kind of like backtrack, from there, like start with the kind of the incidents and just share about that a bit. And then we'll kind of peel back the layers from there.
Yeah, sure. So I was rushing around on a given day to get ready for a conference where I was presenting my doctoral research. So I had gone back to school for my PhD while working probably at least 50 hours a week at that point, traveling a lot. So my program was online. And I had finished that degree. It took me about 3.5 years because I did it part-time on top of this very full-time job. And I was excited because here I was presenting my doctoral research at a conference, a professional well-being conference that I had been looking forward to. The whole time I'm writing my dissertation on the evenings and weekends, all I'm thinking about is presenting at this conference. Someday, if it's good enough, I'll publish the work, I'll present it at this conference.
Wow.
And, so that was the goal. So here it was, finally the day of the event. And I remember waking up, it was probably around 4 a.m, which was not unusual for me, to make this early morning flight. And I was going to try to get up and do yoga before my flight. And I was so overcome with dizziness, I had to lay back down. And so I laid in bed for a while and I said, I've got to make this flight or I'm not going to make it. And I thought, well, maybe if I get up and have a banana, I'll be okay. And so I get up and head towards the kitchen to grab a banana, and I never made it. I ended up collapsing on the floor. We had hardwood floors in the house, and thankfully my husband was home. He had a flight that day as well, but it was later. And so he heard me hit the floor and came and found me face down in a pool of blood because I broke my jaw and, I was bleeding and that sort of thing. And he turned me over and I was unconscious. So thankfully his former skills as a lifeguard came into play, and he, opens my airway. Well, at that point I actually started to breathe, but I was unconscious and he couldn't revive me. So he calls 911. And that's when I come to, is hearing him on the phone to 911, talking about his wife had collapsed. He wasn't sure what happened. It looks like she probably broke something because her face is covered with blood. And I'm hearing this and I'm thinking, what? Like, I'm on the floor. What's happening here?
You're like, I got to get to this conference.
I got to get to this conference. And so I had my eyes closed for quite a period of time. And then I realized that he was on the phone with the paramedics and they were coming. Mm-hmm. And so I opened my eyes and he's like, oh my gosh, she's awake. She's awake. She's breathing and she's awake. So they decided to come anyway. And I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, don't move. You fell, you're bleeding. We're not sure what happened. And so he's, just trying to keep me stabilized. Yeah. And so immediately in my mind, I'm rushing to, okay, the paramedics are on the way. I'm in my bathrobe because I was prepared to get in the shower on the way. I decided to get a banana. I'm going to take a shower. And so I'm like, go get me some clothes, cancel my flight, call my boss and tell them I'm not making it to the conference. Somebody else needs to cover. So that's where I went first, right?
And you said all of that while you were like,
well, I was trying to keep my mouth kind of shut, but because he could tell that my mouth was bleeding, but I was like, I've got a flight, I have to do this. And so I think a lot of that conversation was happening between the time when I kind of came to and realized what was going on. And then I, in the ambulance, in the waiting room, the whole day was in the ER.
Right.
And, at the end of it, I wasn't really sure what had happened. So I had to do a lot of follow-up tests. And I remember going into my doctor after having a full cardiac workup. And he said, this was dehydration and exhaustion. So that's why you fainted. So I had pushed myself, despite my well-being background, despite knowing better, I pushed myself to the point of actual physical collapse. And that's what it took for me to finally realize that nobody was going to help me out of this dilemma that I had been trying to communicate to my friends, my family, to my supervisor for quite some time, that I am maxed out. Mm-hmm. I can't take anymore. I had been telling people, and my family and friends just kept saying, quit your job. because they saw how relentless it was. I was constantly either at work, thinking about work, traveling for work. So it was sort of this all-consuming thing. And it made me very crabby because I thought there is more to me than my job.
Yeah.
I am a whole person, and this is only one part of it, but it's everything.
Well, and were you shocked by the fact that he said, so you said dehydration and just an exhaustion, you said?
Yeah.
And when he said that, like, what was your initial reaction?
To me, it made sense what he was saying. I was just relieved that it wasn't more than that, to be honest. But, I had been getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep for quite a while, and I knew that was insufficient. Because I did research on the connection between sleep and wellness and sleep and health, physical health, as part of my doctoral program. I deeply studied the sleep research for 3 years. So I knew better, but I wasn't able, because I thought, well, I have to get in my physical activity. I've got to do my yoga. I've got to do my, make my juice smoothies in the morning. And I thought, I was like, well, when I graduate, I'll catch up on my sleep. And I was on the way towards reintroducing better sleep, more physical activity, but I was pushing myself pretty hard to get ready for this conference and being away for a week and, presenting my dissertation research. And so, I was really in a place that I think a lot of people can identify right now, being stretched between what you want to do for yourself and what is the right thing to do for yourself, but then trying to live up to the demands that other people have of you and not wanting to let other people down. I didn't want to let down my coworkers or my boss or my organization at the same time.
Yeah. And that's what I'm curious about with you and your story, is kind of like that difference between because you're clearly somebody who puts a lot of demands on yourself. You're a very goal-oriented person. You have high expectations of yourself. And as you and I know, like from the research, like, there's stuff about how certain personality types like are more prone to burnout. And there's kind of the ways that we impose it ourselves, but then there's also all these organizational factors. So in terms of those like demands, like how would you describe like the breakdown for yourself about how much of it were your own kind of demands and maybe like what your goal was with this, this presenting this conference versus that feeling of like kind of pressure from your colleagues or from your manager? Like, talk a bit about that.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation now, because it's taken me a while to unpack this for myself and to make meaning out of it. And to be honest, back then we weren't even really talking about burnout. I didn't even know what it was.
Right.
I had felt
like that we hear about it like however many times a day now, and it wasn't even really part of the lexicon then, because this was
not really
10 or 12 years ago. Is that what you said?
Yeah. And we were talking about stress management. Resiliency was on the move then, but not burnout. And I think that there were a lot of factors. You mentioned that we've now come to learn that there are certain people that are predisposed to there's a higher likelihood of burnout for certain people. And as I've looked into that research, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see this. So here I am, a mid-career female, and I had been promoted. I think I was in my vice president role for maybe a year at this point. Can't remember exactly, but new leadership, trying to prove myself with this new position.
Right.
I wasn't at a point yet where I really had figured out how to transition into a leadership role, which required the ability to be strategic, to be more external and doing thought leadership work, which I was doing at that time, but then also running a department with direct reports and having to deliver my own content, but then also being responsible for others. And so I was still negotiating that piece, and I wanted to do it all. Right. And I think that's what I hear from a lot of people, especially those who are high performers. They want to do it all and they think they can do it all. They're like, if I just get focused enough and disciplined enough and work smarter, not harder, I'll be able to figure this out. And when I went to a supervisor at one point, she could see I was fraying around the edges. I had responded in a reactive way in a meeting with executive leadership, and it was inappropriate the way I had responded because I was so stressed out in that moment.
Mhm.
And she pulled me aside after the meeting, and it was pretty clear that what had just happened was not okay, that I,
Mhm.
kind of frayed a little bit there in that moment. And she said, this is what I remember. I understand what you're going through. I've been there before. No one can figure this out but you.
Mm.
So those were the words. And so I really felt like it was my individual problem.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's
Now I look back and I say, well, I have to own.
how did you feel in that moment when she said that to you like that?
I felt like I was crying for help, and people were telling me there was no help. I was hoping that, and I think there was maybe a little bit of subterfuge on my point, passive aggressiveness of, if I act out, maybe people will realize how bad this is.
Right, right.
And what I realized in that moment is that I wasn't going to get the help that I thought I could get. No one was going to be able to figure out how to balance all these demands. And I think part of it is, especially when you're in an organization where there's a lot of churn in leadership, which there was in my organization at that time, people don't really understand what it is you're doing for your job. Like anytime you have a new leader, which I had at that point, they didn't know really everything that was on my plate. And so in one aspect, she was really right. Like I had to be able to understand enough about my role to figure out what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and to try to think through possible solutions. Whereas I was saying, I need help, and I was looking to her for solutions. And so I think that's the part of this dance that has to be collaborative, because employees do need to be thinking about, I needed to be thinking about, what is it about my job that is within my control?
Right.
What is outside of my control? And being in a state of, high performing person, experiencing imposter syndrome as a female leader mid-career, which is not unusual. The perfectionism that goes with that, wanting everything to be excellent. I had to learn how to set boundaries. And coming out of my ER experience, I realized in that moment, I need to start setting boundaries. And here I might finally have the permission to do that. I needed to give myself permission, because obviously,
You basically like, if you don't want me to lash out like that anymore in front of all the executives, you better let me, give myself some space.
well, and I think, I was reading something by Brene Brown in her book, Atlas of the Heart, and she talks about the difference between stressed and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And in the overwhelmed state, she talks about how we're not even able to come up with solutions. At that point, it's triage. Somebody needs to step in, say, go take a break, get some rest, get yourself together. We're going to take care of the world around you while you do that. I was at the point where I feel like I was in the state of overwhelm. And so when I realized I needed to figure it out, it was like, figure it out. I don't have the mental bandwidth to do this. And
I'm
so
like past that point, basically. Right?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to some of the strategies that I've learned and unpacked over the years and incorporated into my book, I think those are extremely good strategies that can really help us with prevention. I think they're scalable, and they're things that individuals can do and organizations can do, leaders can do. When it comes to actual burnout, you're probably talking about triage. And unfortunately, a lot of people are getting to the point where they are beyond being able to identify the solutions.
Yeah. Totally.
And so once I, was having the ER incident, it's interesting because the doctor said, even though dehydration, fatigue, whatever was the issue, did not say, oh, you have a work release note. I'm recommending you not go back to work. And again, this is because people didn't understand burnout.
Well, wait, say that again.
I was not given any sort of doctor's recommendation that I ease up on my work.
Oh, wow.
So here I am with a broken jaw, and I'm being given, we did not wire my jaw shut because it was only broken in one place. And where the break was in a place that's very sensitive. If I had done surgery, I could have suffered paralysis and nerve damage and that sort of thing. And so the admitting resident said, most people would say wire the jaw. We're not going to do that. But if you stop running an impact activity and you avoid talking a lot, moving your jaw, we think it'll set on its own. And so I said, well, can I have permission not to go back to work because all I do is talk all day long? And they said, well, no, we're not going to give you a note.
Wow.
So I did not have doctor's permission to not go back to work. And I'm thinking to myself,
why not? Why did they say no to that?
I don't know. I can't really tell you why, but I realized when I went home, I'm like, I need a plan. And my leadership, by that time, my husband had communicated to them what had gone on, that this was serious. And he's like, Jess is going to be at home recovering, not at this conference. And people were expecting me to be away for a week. So I had a couple days to figure out a plan. And so I called back my boss and they were like, what can we do? How can we support you? And so that by then I had a plan and I'm like, well, I'm going to be home for the next 2 weeks, but I will work from home. So that's something that I said, this is what I need. I need to work from home for a couple of weeks because I was going into the office every single day. And my doctor wants me not to talk a lot. And so for the first 2 weeks, no meetings. I will communicate via email. I will keep up, but I'm not talking.
Can I just ask you though, first, like, so did you feel like, kind of before, like, as you started to think about what do you really need and like what support do you really like, did you have kind of a bit of a aha moment before that where you felt like, okay, yeah, this is clearly an indication that I've pushed it too far. I do need to take a step back and think about, or were you still kind of in that mindset of kind of like, how can I just handle work and make this work? Like, I guess, what mental state were you in at that point?
I think I was really trying to figure it out. And one of the things that I was starting to notice is that certain parts of my job were not fulfilling. It was monotonous. It was work I didn't want to do. It was work I felt like other people should be doing. And I kept complaining about the work, but I didn't really offer solutions. And I think part of it was I held a certain level of intellectual capital within myself that had not yet been transferred to anybody else. And I was trying to train other people to do this work, but it just kept falling back on me again. And so there was this frustration where I was trying to make attempts to train other people to do work that I felt other people could be doing, but I didn't feel like I had the organizational support for that. And it kept somehow landing back on me again. And so that was really frustrating to me, that I was coming forward with what I thought were some solutions and they weren't being heard. And that's why I feel like, in the individual space, when it comes to things like setting boundaries for yourself, identifying potential solutions, we're hearing a lot about purpose, which, we'll talk hopefully about a little bit. And I understood that some of the stuff I was doing didn't feel aligned with what my purpose was in that organization and what I felt like my interests were at that point. And so I had already started to do some of that work. And that's the individual's responsibilities, to be reflecting on that and thinking about that, maybe coming up with solutions. I've done some analysis and this is what I thought. The organization needs to be meeting that by actually listening and being receptive to.
Right.
So there is really balance in this. And I think I was trying to do some things. And it might have been that once I had gotten to the point of that injury, I felt like I was really ready. My organization was maybe more ready to support me in trying to figure out how do we find our way out of this. So I did have some time to reflect on. And I think a lot of people are quitting their jobs right now because that's the only way they can create the space to even be able to think.
Right.
So now we've pushed it way too far. So I'm all about trying to figure out, well, how do we actually incorporate some of these practices into the way we're doing our work so that people don't have to get pushed to that point.
Yeah. Well, and just to go back to like your request, because I'm curious what specifically then you did when they said, like, how can we support you? Right. Finally, like that question maybe was really direct and something happened that made them, like really kind of listen to what your requests are. Right. Unfortunately, I feel like that is what happens, that things kind of progress to a point where an employee, gets ill, or so there is an incident, or they're saying, basically putting in their resignation. And that's when these conversations happen,
Mhm.
And so my kind of follow-on question is like, do you think these requests would have been met if you had said something a few like weeks earlier or something? But so you asked, I think you said working from home, no meetings for 2 weeks. Is that what you said?
Yes, like no calls.
Yeah.
And then I negotiated that when I did return to work, I needed to limit the hours of calls that I was on, no more than 3 hours a day. I was going to spread them out because at that point it was, if we were to have this conversation by now, my jaw would have been throbbing.
Yeah.
And so I knew that it was very important to my recovery that I put some boundaries around what I could do. And it was up to me to communicate to my leadership what I was capable of. But then my leadership needed to come alongside and support that, which they did.
Mm-hmm.
And, my coworkers and everything, they understood. We had to renegotiate when certain client visits were going to happen because I was doing a lot of support of my peers where I would go out and I was customer facing and I would accompany them.
Mm-hmm.
And so some things needed to be rearranged, but it was the reality of the situation. And because I had a medical incident, they really had to comply with that. Unfortunately, I don't know. Honestly, I would like to think so, but if I had come to them with these solutions, I've got wall-to-wall meetings all day long. I don't start my actual work until 5:30, 6 o'clock at night, which is the reality for a lot of people right now.
Well, can we talk about that for a second? Because so now, and I'm sure you do this now too. Like, I know for me, and I have more control over my time because I have my own business and stuff. But like my whole thing with meetings is that, I prefer not to have meetings on a Monday. I like to have Mondays to digest, to kind of get some priorities done so they're off my mind. And then when I have meetings in the middle of the week, which is where I try to focus it, I also try to focus meetings more on the keep them more in the afternoon. So I can spend my mornings kind of getting some things off my plate and answering emails. And I realized that you mentioned this in your book, that vicious cycle of when the meetings are piling up and then every meeting leads to more action items, right? And you're never the more meetings you have, the more action items you have. Plus there's all the strategic work too, by the way, that you need. So there's this vicious cycle that happens with meetings. So when you say your meetings were that level back to back, why was that? Did you feel like you need to take every meeting that was put on your calendar? Did you not feel like you could block time on your calendar so that people, were meetings just put on your calendar without your permission? Because I know that happens in a lot of corporate environments. It's kind of you get thrown into meetings and all of a sudden you look at your calendar and you have meetings that you didn't necessarily say you can be a part of or you have time for, and your time kind of gets just automatically taken, from not with any malintent, but anyway, you see where I'm going with this. So what was, why was it so out of hand?
I'm going to respond to that question with an eye to those who might be listening and they're trying to figure out the solutions given the reality of their organization. And the reality is for some people, their calendars are not their own. Some organizations, the culture is your calendars are transparent and that people can invite you to things. And then it's up to you to decide, all right, I've got 5 meetings for the same time. You need to then negotiate which of the 5 you're going to do. I was getting to the point where I was getting a lot of demands from different things. And there was a lot of intensity around, I needed to be supporting sales requests. I needed to be supporting clients around existing and new business opportunities. And then I had a team to support and manage their, are they meeting their objectives? And I need to be providing them with the support. And so I maybe about 5 direct reports, not too many, but the kind of manager I wanted to be was one where I was available to them because I felt like my job is to clear the hurdles, not be the bottleneck.
Well, and you knew that you needed support too, that maybe you weren't always getting. So you didn't want to be that consume, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I had one-on-ones with every single team member. I didn't want to let go of those. I had the maybe a meeting with my boss every 2 weeks, which, you know, I prized because, you know, here's a chance for me to get what I needed. And then there were all of these demands, which I didn't feel like I could say no to because the organization has the need. I was the person that they were coming to. I was, up until that incident, really trying hard to negotiate. Do I really need to be in this meeting? Can you have somebody else? I was trying to train my team to take some of the requests, and I was doing regular trainings in my organization to equip others to do some of the work that me and my team were doing into their job. So I was taking proactive efforts to try to get some of this stuff off of my calendar. At the end of the day, when I would protect time and I said, well, I know I'm working on, for example, submitting a manuscript for publication, because that was part of one of the objectives of my team at that time. That was a deliverable, and it was a performance review thing. Did we succeed in publishing a certain number of studies?
Right.
And so I tried to fiercely protect the work, but then when something new would come up, some emergency, some fire drill from somebody in the business, I would say, well, I can do that later. And the reality was I could do it later in my own time. And it didn't feel like it was appropriate for me to say, well, I've got this time blocked out for this manuscript that's due, you know, when we've got an urgent business need. And so I think that was really hard. And I'm guessing a lot of people can relate to that feeling of, I don't even understand what I can say no to anymore.
Right. And how do you think like organizations like address something like that? You know, like really explicitly stating to the, like to their employees, like, real policies around this in terms of like respecting people's time and having people really feel in control of their time. Like, do you have any like ideas in terms of the specifics of how to like really, because as you and I know, like one of the causes of burnout, and you've mentioned a few of them, which would be probably good to just like break down. Like you definitely mentioned a lack of support, which is a huge driver of burnout. Long or irregular hours, is another piece of it. And then there's the high job demands, unreasonable time pressure, which is like another one. I feel like you kind of check the boxes of a lot of those kind of, root causes. And I feel like there's got to be almost like a way that organizations, hit on each one of those and do something proactive. So like when it comes to the long hours, just in and of itself, like I feel like everyone just kind of needs to at least start there. Just like, what could have helped with that, I guess, like, just hearing your manager or the company say like, hey, your time is your time. You can say no. Like, what are any thoughts on kind of how to address that in organizations?
Yeah, I think it's hard for organizations to come up with mandates around how to manage this that's going to work for everybody, because each type of job is so unique to its own pressures. But there are things that organizations are doing. One of them that I am embracing and I'm trying to practice myself as an independent now is, standard meetings are not the full 30 minutes, the full hour, or the full 90. It's baking that recovery time into a meeting. And so some organizations are now starting to say, we're actually creating meeting software and designing it so a default meeting time is 25 minutes, not 30. It's 45 minutes, not 60. When you've got a working meeting that goes 3 hours, there's a, meeting norms are that there's a decent break built into that. You don't just power through lunch. Right. And so I think that the organizations can look at their norms around meetings and create more well-being supportive kinds of approaches to meetings. Understanding that when individuals go into a meeting and they're coming out with deliverables, which not is true for everybody. Some people, they do their work in the meeting, right? And so I know people and they just go from meeting to meeting all day, but the work is in the meeting. And that's because it's the nature of their job. For other people, a lot of people, they walk away and they're like, well, this request is an hour's worth of work. And so it's about, then it's a negotiation of when something comes out of, there's an expectation that you're going to meet these deliverables. You've got to really be thinking clear about, what do I have the bandwidth to actually pull off?
Right. And that's
in
hard.
a core workday. It's very, very hard. And then to communicate that, and then the negotiation begins of, this is how much time I need. And then if they're saying, well, I don't have that time, then you might need to go to your manager if it's a higher level request and say, I need to clear these meetings.
Right.
And sometimes
and then like having that confidence, especially if you're of a lower level position, like to have that confidence and connection with your manager to be honest about that. That's like a whole other issue outside of just figuring out the time itself that you need, right? I mean, it's a complex challenge.
It really is. And the reality of today is a lot of people have left their organizations. Those who've remained are usually absorbing the work. And so as a result of where we've been the last 3 years in organizations, people are now carrying 2, 3, 4 jobs. And organizations are making the decision not to backfill positions there. And so I know somebody who is in a pretty high level leadership position within her organization, but there's a point where she's at a point where she can't make decisions above a certain point. And so she's gone to her leadership and said, this is 2 jobs, not 1. I've lived into the reality of that. I've been carrying these 2 jobs for a full 1.5 years, and I've got some ideas about how we could split it into 2 jobs. That was what I needed to do with my job to get a handle on the demands.
Right.
In my case, my leadership met me halfway and they said, we totally get what you're saying. These are the kinds of things that belong in a vice president role. These are the kinds of things that don't make any sense anymore. Let's work on a transition plan to add a role and have you train the people. And so, and we were able to actually not add a role, a head count. What we were able to do is train and promote people beneath me who were in the organization already. They were promoted up, they got new training, and they were able to lead some of the things I had been leading. So it was sort of a win-win, right? Because I got some of the pressure taken off of me. The organization doesn't have to add a head count, but they're willing to promote and give people the training they need and the resources they need.
Right.
And then so they get
happened after
growth. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so that's what happened in my situation. Other people that I know who are in the same exact position I was are going to their leadership and they're saying, I have some solutions. I have some ideas about how to make this workable. And they are being told, no, make it work. We're not going to give you new resources. This is the job. That's the way it is. And that's what's so frustrating about this burnout conversation is we can equip employees with understanding some of these strategies. And we've been doing this for decades. Time management, come on. We've been talking about this forever.
Right.
But the organization does need to think more carefully about what are its policies and its norms around email? Do they copy everybody? Do they expect a response within minutes or hours, or can people take a few days?
Right.
Do people have to respond to email while on vacation and on the weekends?
Yeah.
And a lot of this comes from what people see their leadership doing. And so there are these unspoken norms in organizations. And I was definitely subject to that. I saw people replying to emails all around the clock, even on vacation. And I was like, well, that's what's expected of somebody in my position.
Yeah.
And so there's that permission piece. And when I started to push back, I was a little bit scared. I'm like, well, at this point I was thinking, if they say no, they say no, but I can at least ask the question. And by that point, I feel like I was to the level where I knew I needed to take control of my well-being. And I thought, well, the worst thing they can do is fire me for saying this, but I'm going to try. And so I did have to take some risks. Other people are not in a position to do that. And again, that's why this makes this conversation so difficult. Yeah. Because some people they're not empowered. The organization does have these norms of hustle, and this is what it takes. And they feel like if they say something, that means they're going to be overlooked for promotion. Yep. They will be overlooked for bonuses. And that somehow it's going to come back and
Well, or
negatively.
that it'll be because I've definitely heard this like from interviews I've done with employees where a big part of it is like just not wanting to look like they can't handle it, like wanting to look like that kind of person that can make it work, like people use that language all the time. I'll make it work, I'll figure it out. And like I feel like so the language and like empowering employees with with like the language around this stuff is really important. And you and I have talked about the fact that this really needs to start with the employer in terms of really getting to the crux of these issues, but there's also ways to empower the employees. But like, I feel like there needs to be, like almost like training around the language of this stuff to say like, when you're talking about what you need, if you put it in the context of like, look, I want to do really well at my job and I want to stay engaged. Like I love what I'm working on, but this is taking away from my engagement, or this is taking away from my ability to be really productive because having too much on my plate, I'm like diluting my work because I'm not putting like my best foot forward into those things. So it's like talking about like making your requests with this context of like, I want to be the best. I want to be productive. I want to be engaged in my work. I want to be committed, like being able to say it like that rather than from a place of weakness, like I can't handle it. Right. Or and people should be able to say it that way too. But like point being that sometimes saying it that way can make it feel more empowering for the employee and enable the employee to tell the truth that it's like, hey, I want to be great and I want to be this kind of and this is not just getting things done and checking off a million things off of a to-do list in a week is not productivity. Like that's just checking things off, right? And real productivity requires more focused energy, being able to tackle the things that really feel like priorities and stuff. So anyway, sorry for the tangent, but I feel like part of it is like just really knowing how to say those things that you need to say, right? Like, because I think some people just struggle with finding the language, like of really what to say. Do you agree with that?
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Danielle. As I was reading again, I just came off of reading Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart, and she talks about the importance of language and how much it matters. And I'm thankful that we are in a place now that we understand what burnout is. We know what it is. There is research. Yep. You mentioned it. We already know what the drivers are. We know the organizational drivers. We know the individual predispositions that put us up for risk. So there is a lot that we know. And the challenge is that a lot of people haven't been given this knowledge yet. And so there is, I think, a lot of training that's happening around this at all levels where people like you and I are going into organizations and helping them to understand these are the things that are your responsibility as an organization. Let's look at how work gets done. Can we change some of these processes? We're bringing the research in to say, oh, by the way, tracking everybody down to minute in that level of detail is actually not productivity, as you said, like helping them to understand some of these drivers and then giving people the language to be able to speak to it. And so one of the things that I was looking at coming out of one of the popular burnout assessment tools is this idea that, true burnout, which is now being used as an umbrella term for all mental health issues. Right. People are like, I'm so burnt out.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, well, now let's unpack this. And so there are really three core pieces of burnout. It's that exhaustion, fatigue. In my case, it was bone crushing, painful levels of fatigue, falling asleep.
Literal bone crushing, right?
Oh, yeah. But I would fall asleep over my work in my office.
Wow.
And so I took
at the office.
Yes, I would be, doing this. And so I took to standing, using a standing desk at work, so I wouldn't fall asleep while doing the work. I mean, that's how bad it was, right?
Gosh.
And so there you go. There's exhaustion, right? You've got the next one, which is feeling ineffective in your work. And I think that this is related to disengagement, because when you feel like no matter what you do, you can't be effective. And it might be because you're It might be because you're exhausted, but there might be organizational contributors to you being ineffective in your work. And that can lead to a disengagement. So the ineffectiveness is a part of it. And then there is cynicism. And that's one of the things people don't talk about enough, but it is this idea where your own mental self-talk starts to, it gets into your head. It surfaces in your verbalizations with other people. People can hear it. People can hear cynicism. And
and that's part of what came out with you when you, with what happened in front of the executives, right? Weren't you at that point where you were just like more cynical, kind of like, just didn't care anymore?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was not effectively communicating my case for the change that I wanted to see. And I verbalized it in a really flippant kind of way that ended up sounding very cynical. And I knew it was inappropriate right after I said it. My boss pulled me aside after the meeting. She knew it was inappropriate. But back then we didn't know, cynicism, this kind of cynicism, which I was exhibiting plenty of that in my communications with my peers. They could have seen this. That we didn't know that was one of the warning signs of burnout.
Yes.
Right. And so now that we know this information, we can start to notice it in ourselves, and we can notice it in one another. And I think that can be really helpful, because it can be hard for us sometimes to see it in ourselves. And so as I work with individuals and I hear the self-talk being verbalized, I'm like, hold it just a minute. This is what I just heard you say. This isn't actually true. It'd be something that they said about themselves. I am just not a good leader. I've heard this from people who are extremely effective. And I'm like, no. You are actually an extremely qualified and competent leader. And let's talk about what makes you think this about yourself.
Yeah.
So,
and I want to just pause there. And I do want to I feel like I really do want to just talk to you for 3 hours about this, but, we'll make sure we have breaks and stuff. No, but, so just to reiterate though, because I think it is important. So burnout, to your point, burnout has gotten used interchangeably with a lot of different things. It is not the same as mental ill health, stress, anxiety. Burnout can lead to those things. Stress and anxiety can be part of it, but burnout is a work-related phenomenon that is characterized by 3 things that you mentioned. So one being that level of cynicism, or the first one we should start with is the exhaustion, but even more so, it's emotional exhaustion, because to your point, there's this feeling of fatigue in the mind, not just physically, like you said, falling asleep, it's a combination of, it's not just a physical exhaustion. There's an emotional exhaustion, doing work that really, is too challenging for too long. And just that the emotional and the mental exhaustion that comes with that. And then there's the second kind of component of burnout, just to summarize what you were saying, is that lack of perceived competence, and that, where your confidence in yourself and your work starts to diminish. And then cynicism, that those are signs of just not, caring anymore, and those, I think it's important for people listening to understand that that is how it shows up when somebody's already burnt out. Those are the things that show up. Those aren't necessarily the causes. They're actually not the causes. We know what the causes really are. But it's important to know what it looks like, because then when you start to see people who, are showing signs within those 3 categories, that's how you know to say, if you are a manager, hey, how are you doing? Are you feeling burnt out? What are some of the sources of your stress right now? What are some of your biggest challenges, so that I can give you the support you need, right? Because some people, you shared, it's you might not just be getting the training that you need on some things, or getting your questions answered, or things like that. So knowing that once those signs show up, to ask some of those questions that directly kind of address burnout is super important. So would you say that's a fair summary, and everything I said there, first of all? Because I feel like it's important that we make sure people understand those 3 categories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, addressing the challenges once it gets to that point, and it's likely not one employee, by the way, there are other employees in the organization, because it is an organizational phenomenon. burnout is.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are pieces of the environment that are contributing. And so if one person is to the point where they're fried crispy, like I was,
Yes.
there are lots of people on their way there. Lots of people on their way there.
Well, can you talk about some of those things? Like, let's talk about what some of those specific organizational drivers are. I think that would be really helpful.
Well, actually, what I really like to do is have a conversation about prevention, if that's okay.
Yeah, go. Yeah, sure.
Because I feel like a lot of what I learned in my journey from burnout back to a place of personal and professional thriving, which I wasn't in a place where I had the luxury of quitting my job. And I didn't really want to change my job. I liked the organization. I believed in what it was doing. I liked my coworkers. And there were pieces of my job that I really, really loved. Yeah. And I felt like this is advancing the kind of work I want to do in the world. And not a lot of other organizations were doing the kind of work that my organization was at that time. And so it wasn't just a cut and run. And so I was very pleased that I was able to work with my leadership and while maintaining employment and being effective and meeting goals, I was able to create a plan where other people got the training they needed. I was able to promote members of my team. And then I started to build myself back to a place of well-being. And those strategies that I used to build myself back to a place of personal and professional thriving, I think could be used to prevent burnout.
Oh, yes. Well, so that you want to talk about.
I did want to talk about that.
That sounds great. We should.
And so a lot
you said in your book, I actually want to read a line from your book that I was like, you said you feel like you've really cracked the code on how to balance physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, career, and financial well-being. So that's a pretty bold statement to make. So I'm curious what that code is and some of these strategies are that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I feel like for every person that's going to be unique to them. But these three things, as I've looked into the research since this time, so now I've had the benefit of 12 years putting it into practice in my own life and then doing some deep research to understand what's the evidence base underneath this. Can workplaces do this, or is it an individual journey? And I've come to a point of saying, my journey was largely an individual journey, but it didn't have to be. Right. And that's why I wrote this book, is to help organizations understand that. So the three pieces that I focus on in the book are in the title. It's how do we address individual sense of purpose and how that might align with one's work. The next one is social connection. We spend at least half of our waking hours with our coworkers or thinking about work or communicating with them in text messages or emails. Let's pay attention to the quality of those relationships and those connections. I started to do that work, deep work, coming out of my burnout episode, and that really helped me. And then this third piece I call Transcendence, and it has to do with flow, awe, wonder, joy. What are the things that really spark those moments of uplift? And I like to think of them as what fills your bucket versus what's draining your bucket.
Yeah, I love that.
And there are a lot of things
I love how you said the moments of uplift. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing is we can design our workplaces. We can design our own approach to work as individuals that help us to become more aware of the importance of those things and fostering them in our lives. And it's not that every single moment of your work has to be this blissful place. Right. That's not the nature of work. But can we have 5 minutes in a day, an entire work day, that we intentionally reflect back and say, what were the uplifts in my day, and paying attention to what were they, and then what were the circumstances around which they existed. And
and are those three, are those mainly more the strategies you used for yourself to bring, or do you also use those same three as a framework for organizations, or is it more individual focused?
No, in my book, I talk about, I'm a big believer in the socio-ecologic model. So this is theory. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates when we address these big thorny problems from a multi-level approach, that we are more successful. And so for each of these three areas, purpose, connection, and transcendence, I present individual, interpersonal. So now we're talking about groups.
Yeah.
I talk about organizational, so the way work is designed. And I talk about the special role of leaders, especially the manager, supervisor. And I talk about how we need to be thinking about solutions and each of these three specific areas, purpose, connection, and transcendence, from those levels. And so there are roles for individuals. There are ways that managers can foster this.
Yeah, that makes such a big difference.
Yeah.
With social connection, what are your thoughts on being able to do that remotely versus in person? Because I feel like we really are just not valuing the importance of real in-person connections. And I know that I really do love the in-person, but I know but do you feel do you feel like to get that genuine and that deep connection that people have to be in the office and seeing each other more, or no?
I think it is possible for us to have deeper levels of connection than we do now virtually. Is there something special about in person? Absolutely. There is something special about being in person, but it is also possible to be gathering with people in person and it not be a deep enough level of connection to feel meaningful to people. And I'm afraid that what I'm seeing with organizations that are mandating, you're going to go back to work this many days a week, that's just the way it is, because they understand that there is this research, or maybe intuitively they just know magic happens when people gather. But that doesn't mean that they are designing the return to work scenario, because the way in-person work looks now is totally different. Some people might not even be going back to their own desk. They might not even know where their team is in the building. Right.
Yeah.
And there's this quite robust conversation going on LinkedIn around this right now, around how when organizations return to work, how can they be crafting intentional ways to bring people back together in ways that do deepen the level of social connection. And there's plenty of research that helps organizations to figure out how to design for this. But some of this same research can be applied to the virtual space as well. And I know I'm seeing it in the managers I'm working with, how they're 100% virtual. How are they working with their internationally distributed teams to bring a stronger level of team cohesion? People who've never even met themselves and each other in person. How are they building team cohesion and care for one another into the fabric of how work gets done? It is possible. I've seen it. There's research to guide us. So
and
I think it's a false dichotomy.
Well, the care, seems simple, but it's the care word is so important. We know from engagement research, right? Gallup has done a lot of studies on this, on that employees want to feel like they are cared for, cared as a human being by their manager, by their organization. And that through intention, your point about the returning to the office and all of that, if the mandates were built around the philosophy that relationships, we value relationships, we want you to have this time together, we want that would have a different ring to it than you're coming in the office and then people are just sitting at their desk not talking to anybody. Then it's what's the point of being here, but I just feel that the social connection piece is so important, especially as we see loneliness being on the rise. And I think a lot of people think they're better off, or just want to be home and just kind of chugging through things or whatever, but almost don't know what's good for us sometimes. We might, all of a sudden we get to the office and we see a person, we feel so much better to have that connection, to get out of our house, to go, to just walk, and so I feel there's just kind of we have to re-explore social connection, right? And what that means post-COVID. But I definitely want you to spend a little time on the transcendence piece. And I hate to save the one of the most important pieces to the end of this conversation. We have only a few minutes left, but please, expand on that a bit, and like, and also what that looks like in an organization, like even just bringing that word into organizations, like what does that really mean for them?
Yeah, we could have such a long conversation about this, so
That
we're
could be
going
a
to run out of
whole
time. But
itself. Yeah.
Transcendence, the word, I kept thinking, is there a different word? Is there a better word? Is there a more relatable word? And it's the right word, because it means a lot of different things. And at its core, it's about rising above and beyond something to an elevated or superior state. Some of us describe this as consciousness, but it's also a more lay person's way of thinking about it. Might be it's about connecting to something bigger than ourselves.
Right.
And that can be connecting to a cause, for example. It could be a deeper connection with nature. And a lot of organizations know this. They know that people experience perspective shifts differently when they have access to nature.
Yeah.
And so for years, we've seen organizations design beautiful spaces. They're bringing the outside light in, they're bringing plants in, they might have a fountain with, water going. And so people have understood, organizations have understood that we can design with intent for people to experience nature, and it's not just about relaxation, right?
Right.
Transcendence is about, inner shift that does influence our mental perspective about things. And so when we experience states, self-transcendent mental states like awe, for example, or flow, or wonder, all of which are self-transcendent mental states, when we experience that, it allows us to view the world around us differently. We might respond with more curiosity. We might have the ability to problem solve in a different way. We might have an ability to respond with more compassion and empathy. And the research, by the way, shows that all of these things follow from. And so self-transcendent mental states are something that, when organizations foster that, and when we can foster that for ourselves, it does lead to things that businesses care about. Creativity, problem solving. There's even research that shows, for our DEI listeners out there, it shows that when we experience these self-transcendent mental states, not only are we more compassionate, we are more likely to want to help and be kind to other people. And we're more open to and receptive to including people who are different from us. So now we're talking about inclusion, right? And so self-transcendent mental states and experiencing transcendent moments as part of our work is highly related to social connection. Because when you look at that being connected to something bigger than ourselves, it's understanding this is who I am and what makes me unique and what I have to offer and the value I bring. But then I'm understanding a connection that I have with the world around me in a unique way. And it's those two things together. I am a small part of this bigger whole, and yet I have value and something to contribute to making the world a better place.
Would you say that I love all that. And would you say that that's like the difference between, kind of getting in touch with your soul versus like your mind, and it just being kind of a mental state? And that's also synonymous with, like, when you talk about spiritual well-being, is that kind of where you're headed with spiritual well-being, or is that something different?
Well, when I talk about spiritual well-being, I talk about attending to our sense of purpose and our values and our beliefs in the world. That's a part of it. I talk about this sense of connection and belonging and community with other people. That's part of spiritual. A lot of people are now carving that out and calling it social, but it's actually part of spirituality. If you look at the way research has defined spiritual, it includes that sense of community and belonging. And then transcendence is the piece that we often think about when we think about spirituality, but I think about that as only one piece. And these are highly interrelated. When we are experiencing transcendence, oftentimes it is in the company of other people that we experience that. And in the book, I tell a story at the opening of the Transcendence chapter about a transcendent experience I had within the workplace, where I had an awakened and new and fresh sense of how I contributed to my team, how my team contributed to me, and our interdependence on one another.
When did you have that? Like,
that was 2019. It was in the fall, and it was at a conference that it was part of a team I'd been part of for a while. It was at an event that we did every single year, but this particular year was very different. And there was a reason for why that year was different. The way we were working together had been intentionally monkeyed with over the course of a year. And it has to do with who was in leadership at the time was saying that it is important how we treat one another as part of our work.
Saying it is.
It is. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so we really established through hard work and over time, a culture of caring. And the previous year, I'd been at the exact same conference with, I believe, most, if not all of the same team members. And I was feeling in the same exact role, by the way, doing the same exact work. I was experiencing isolation and loneliness and disengagement in that moment. And over the course of a year, with some intentionality on my part and on the part of my leadership and on the part of my colleagues, we developed a culture of caring for one another. And it made that experience different. And I experienced that moment of transcendence that I describe in the book. And so there is a ton of research to guide us in this. We are not alone, and it isn't an individual journey. It's a collective journey that we have to take. So that's why I wrote the book, is to reconnect us with this wisdom that's been out there for quite a long time. We just aren't bringing that into the well-being conversation and into workplace culture conversations. And so that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to be able to help people with that.
Well, I love it. And I'm making my way through the book. I can't wait to get to that part of it, because I feel like out of all of the kind of research that I've been reading and stuff, I haven't really gotten into that. So I'm excited to learn more about that whole, because I'm so intrigued by that. I feel like it's so important. And like you and I were talking about at the beginning of this conversation before we were like recording, was like, just like how much that's like missing from humanity, because, we see the reports on loneliness increasing and all of that, but it's like, we're talking about loneliness and then happiness and these things that are still, I feel like, not really getting to the crux of it, of like, just like really tapping into these deeper levels and getting, really having transcendence be more of the end state that we're aiming for, as opposed to something that's more like low level. Like, I feel like there needs to be this elevation of, of humanity that needs to happen. I think it's part of like why we're experiencing all of this turmoil and everything that has happened. But so anyway, I know we need to wrap up, but I love like ending on that note. And if you don't mind, maybe just, just like in the last like minute or so, if you could just like, maybe what are some of the like specific things that you do to access that state, just in your own individual like practice? What do you kind of, are there any just like specific things that you do to kind of like head more towards that state of transcendence?
Since we only have a minute, and this is a 90-minute talk, the one thing that I will talk about is presence mindfulness. Those are two different things. Mindfulness practices can help us to be more present in the moment. And when I look at one of the practical ways organizations and individuals can foster transcendence in these mental states, flow, for example, this is a big one, but some of these other mental states is through practicing mindfulness and practicing presence in our work. And there are a lot of things organizations can do to design the way work happens to make these kinds of practices more likely to happen. But at the end of the day, it's also about each one of us being more intentional. We have to do the work to build the practice of mindfulness or meditation, whatever it takes to foster presence. And there are a lot of things that I talk about in my book that can foster that, things that we can do in our environments to create the circumstances that help us to be more present. It's got the most research under it than any practice that I talk about in that
mindfulness
chapter.
Does you're talking about?
Mindfulness does. Yeah. And so we're now seeing organizations, and they're rolling out mindfulness apps, and they might even have a mindfulness room where, this is a quiet space people can go set aside. it's not really enough. I think organizations that are designing intentionally around this are doing a lot more around that. It's about creating that mental space for people.
Right.
And that's about designing the flow of how work gets done, that people have that ability to even have the mental space.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reminders, just, and I think about this, I've been writing a lot about this in my own work around purpose work and how mindfulness really supports the pillar of purpose, because, as you're doing your work throughout the day, connecting with, am I aligned with my purpose in this work? How could I do this work differently in a way that contributes to me feeling like I'm living out my purpose?
Yeah.
And so then we talk about, how do I show up in the world? We're talking about values. We're talking about our beliefs about how we ought to act in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes presence for us to reflect on, am I working in a way that has me showing up the way I want to be showing up? Am I having this conversation in a way that's going to foster stronger social connection with other people? Like, these things are all interrelated. Mm-hmm. And that's why I put all these things, these three things together under the umbrella of spirituality, because they do all, it's not three separate things and like, oh, pick this strategy and then this strategy and this strategy. They all weave together and support each other. So
well, I love that. Well, we didn't even really get to purpose, which I love talking about. So I do feel like maybe we need to have just a follow-up conversation and go deep on that one and some of the things we just started touching on on the end here. But thank you so much for this. I just feel like this was such a great and just like authentic conversation about all of this stuff. And the work you're doing is really amazing. And I really admire and respect you so much. So thank you so much for this. And what is the best, like what's your, if you wanted to say like your website, or the best way for people to kind of reach out to you or learn more about your work?
Yeah, if people want to learn more about what I'm up to these days, what I'm working on.
And read the book, obviously.
Yeah.
More about what you were talking about.
That'll help you get to know me as a human. Definitely reading the book, because my story's all over in it. But if you want to follow what I'm doing work-wise, you can go to my website at jessicagrossmeier.com. And that gives you a sense for how I'm working with organizations today. Mm-hmm. And if you want to follow what I'm thinking about, I'm also posting quite a bit on LinkedIn, and I'm continuing to think about how to apply some of these concepts to the thorny problems in the workplace today. And, I don't have all the answers, Danielle, which is why I love talking with people like you, because I think together we can collectively bring this information and think about, well, how do we design for the future of work in a way that feels, more enriching and fulfilling for people. Mm-hmm. And that's work we need to do. And it's going to take all of us. So thank you for inviting me in this conversation. And
thank you.
People can follow me on LinkedIn and contribute to my ongoing thinking and learning about this stuff.
All right, great. Well, thank you. And have a great rest of your week. And I will keep you posted as I make my way through your book, because I really am enjoying it. And I can't wait to like explore more of what you kind of like touched on today.
All right. Thanks so much. It's a fun conversation.
Bye. Thanks, Jess.